Hey, what's going on everyone? Clocked it here. So, if you like retro content, if you like Nintendo, Sega, or just game in general discussions, then please, smash that like button and stick around for content which I'll be bringing for this year and what my channel is all about. But this is a Metroid Prime review, right? So, to put my hype for Prime 4 into context, I think it's important to remember something as a Nintendo fan during that time. Unlike other console manufacturers and developers, we were still at a point where we hadn't seen a number of Nintendo IPs in HD for the first time. So yes, Metroid in HD for the first time was always going to be hype, and Metroid Dread, eventually showed us why. But this was Metroid Prime, a series I class as one of the best trilogies ever, and also a trilogy of games from a game design perspective I class as near perfection. There are no other games like Metroid Prime, because no other games have a character like Samus Aran with all the tools she has at her disposal. Even when Prime 1 first released back in 2002, I bought and imported a Platinum US GameCube with the game, because I was unwilling to wait the months I had to wait for the UK release. I was already a long-time Metroid fan since Metroid 2 on a Game Boy. I was working in the game shop at the time. Halo Combat Evolved, hype was still around, but as much as I love Combat Evolved, that Metroid fan, or that Nintendo fan in me, wanted to show just how great Metroid Prime looked in comparison, and the innovations it was also bringing. So I take my Platinum GameCube into work, plug it into the TV, and let people see and play Metroid Prime early. But with that little bit of history over with, and with me now completing Metroid Prime 4 Beyond twice, how do I feel about it? Let's not waste any more time and roll straight into this review like a morph ball. Metroid Prime's 4's art direction is stunning. Simple as that. Retro Studios has always had a knack of getting the most out of Nintendo machines whilst using distinct art styles, which in my opinion, rarely, if ever, get old. Personally, I could return to the GameCube version of Metroid Prime and still say that it looks fantastic. This helps because the art style for the Prime series has always been pushing for a semi-realistic approach, but utilizing colors and textures in a way which prevents it from looking, let's say in quotations, photorealistic. For me, it's a type of visual look I find, almost perfect for video games. Somewhat similar to what the Metal Gear series brought, especially Metal Gear 2 and 3. Retro wastes no time in showing us this new visual approach to Prime 4 with its absolutely stunning cinematic intro, something many of us Metroid fans reacted to with insane hype. Seeing Samus in her gunship taking on enemy spacecrafts with her ship's guns and missiles, I freaking loved that intro and have rewatched it multiple times. It's just so good. The environments in this game as a Prime fan, or even just as a gamer, speak to me in the best possible way. All the little intricate details are there for you to just get absorbed into the world. This is what Metroid Prime is all about. I have absolutely zero issues with how this game looks, and this translates into how the game sounds as well. Enhanced by the visuals. Vuros as a world looks and sounds as alien as you'd like a world to sound. in a video game, and there were so many moments in this game where I was like, yeah, yes, now this is a Prime game. You just can't help but be drawn into the vibes of each area, and through their sights and sounds. Prime 4 delivers this, I feel, without exception. Then you have Viola. This vehicle, although a little foreign at first reveal for the Metroid game, Viola, allowed Metroid to have its first semi-open world, one which actually felt large and open, yet still confined enough, to get a sense of a journey, but one that doesn't overstay its welcome by being too big, I feel. The desert, without a multitude of unnecessary distractions, I felt like a breather in between the busy, more focused areas. I for one, enjoyed the silence of Soul Valley, allowing the desert to actually feel desolate and eerie to me. A world almost, like stripped of life. Its winds, like telling a tragic story to no one. Almost, I guess, reminiscent of games like Pan's Dragoon or animes like Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind. Some of my favorites. For me, Viola was a joy to control. I never had any issues with its controls. Whether I was leaping over sand dunes, power sliding through green crystals, or just stalking the few enemies you encounter in this wilderness. The way I personally played the game was to collect green crystals when and as I saw them, as I traveled somewhat in the direction of where I wanted to go. So for me, I never encountered any issues when the game came. When the end of the game came, and you were reminded that you had to collect green crystals as part of the main mission, as the chosen one, to take the memory fruit of the Le Morne to a new world. Whilst there were a few scattered shrines around Soul Valley, which granted Samus extra powers as well as some short yet fun puzzles, I do feel that the use of Viola could have had more challenges and mini-games in the open world. Even if that meant Le Morne time trials, accomplishments like highest or longest jumps over sand dunes or through some of the circled arches that you see scattered around. I don't know, destroying certain rogue enemies located in parts of the map, having to chase them across Soul Valley, or even using a training ground in Vault Forge, as a somewhat extreme G on the N64, like a mini game against AI machines or even ghosts of other players. I think this would have given more purpose and things to do for the bike and the traversal in question. Perhaps you'd even need to obtain green crystals by being taken by Le Morne rogue AI across Soul Valley, and you have to chase them, and maybe like they're like carrying freights and stuff like that. Having played through the game on through both normal and hard modes, in order to capture some additional footage for this video, I started the game in casual. I restarted the game in casual mode, and it actually relieved one of my frustrations with the game. I found on both normal and hard, the majority of enemies took far too many hits to defeat, or would often cause too much damage. Especially like the Le Mans Cybots, whose lasers could deal like 50% of an energy tank. Which is a staggering amount of damage for the Metroid game. But on casual, things actually felt more normal, more regular. This leads into the combat, which still remains very Metroid Prime. With the added extra of being able to both lock onto an enemy whilst also having full control of where you can shoot this time. One thing I later learned, which helped me on hard mode, is that you actually deal more damage with headshots, which is almost crucial to use on hard modes, because hard mode is really brutal at the start where you don't have that many energy tanks. What also became somewhat crucial in hard modes was using your psychic shot, which on normal in battle I barely used, and this was mostly due to its damage amount and also speed of execution. The psychic shot for combat was definitely feeling underbaked, but at the same time for certain bosses, its use I found to be very fun and brought back some of the Metroid Prime boss battle mechanics where you use many of Samus's unique abilities for some gameplay. Something this game overall doesn't reach the same heights of, say, Metroid Prime 3, which still shines as a beacon of Metroid Prime gameplay mechanics, along with like combat gameplay and enemies designed around those gameplay and hardware innovations. A standard shot known as like the psychic beam in this game deals the most damage overall, which unfortunately negates the use of standard missiles or charge beams. Something which has never happened in a Metroid game before. If I was going to ask for one patch, it would be weapon damage and enemy health. The only missiles I truly found use of against enemies were the ice missiles that obviously freeze them momentarily, and then with the fire missiles coming second just to give that a rolling extra damage for a few seconds. The psychic abilities overall could have been used to much greater effect as well, I feel, even though they were cool. Although used for some things, like psychic shots and powers should have had way more use for puzzles and gameplay. I feel, and perhaps the ability to create like a ghost double of yourself, like in Luigi's Mansion 3, a somewhat double Samus in ghost form, or perhaps a psychic ability where you could travel through specific walls, like in Soul Reaver, or even better, actually along those lines, a psychic realm could exist beyond just invisible platforms, because at the end of the day, you are able to see this psychic realm when you see the Le Mans and stuff like that. In turn, this could have also been used to see Le Mans story elements of their fall. Perhaps seeing moments of their spirits in psychic mode. As an example, you enter a rundown area full of broken computers, looking psychic mode, and see a Le Mans like frantically initiating a computer before it's like overwhelmed by a group of grievers. I think through this vision, you might then see a hidden path the Le Mans locked or something like that, just an extra dynamic. Yet still, for myself playing through the world, I couldn't help but be engaged and eager to see what's next through the story. Even with getting sidetracked by green crystals, the story moved along at a good pace. Many of the boss encounters are great fights. Some of the best I feel in Prime history. Some of the cutscenes I absolutely fell in love with. Whilst others I felt should have been a moments where this could have been an in-game event. Especially one escape scene from an explosive facility on your bike. You escape from it, and then basically it just shows you and flying off on your bike. Perhaps that was an indication of this game's clearly long and rumored development, turbulent development. And I think I'll be talking, but there's other things. I think I'll be talking about like Ice Belt as a Metroid location, as an example of peak Metroid Prime in terms of atmosphere. At least for me. From like its initial eerie silence when you enter the facility, or even just enter the first area, you got this lovely panel review. You get like this foreboding moments of tense horror which I was actually legit surprised with. And also then to when the power turns back on and the whole all hell breaks loose, or even as early as Voltforge, where you first obtain Viola, and then that music kicks in. The game moved at a great pace and delivered quality in its delivery in many areas, I felt. This was even the same for me when engaging with the Federation troopers, whose voice acting wise for the most part I thought, were great. And visually each one looked unique and memorable, with the Calm Hunter, what's his name, Tokabi, being my personal favourite. As for the others and all the noise around them, especially Miles McKenzie, it was, in my mind, it was overblown as I thought. But, I think I realized something, after playing the game in regards to Miles. I don't even think it was his dialogue, momentary tag along at the start of the game, or the game hints that really got to people. I personally think it was how he looked under his mask. As harsh as this sounds, remove his glasses, and I honestly believe he wouldn't have been viewed as bad. He's a somewhat odd-looking character, reminiscent of Rick Moranis, which others I've mentioned. But what was on my mind was, in this futuristic universe, would people really be wearing glasses, that shape and size at all? Underneath such a equipment, because even when his armor comes down, it's clearly equipped with his own binoculars, unique to Miles's armor. But anyway, the dialogue of the game I found to be good and similar enough to Metroid Prime 3, better than Prime 3 in terms of dialogue, I think. So yeah, overblown for sure, but each to their own. I'm not going to spend any more time on it, especially after my last video went about. But, then we got Samus herself. There were many moments where our favorite heroine, delivered peak Metroid moments. And even times had me laugh or smile with some of her gestures, like a subtle wave goodbye to the Federation troopers. Samus looks stunning in this game as well, with the Viola suits, being one of my favorite looking suits now. But at the same time, I do feel that Samus regressed in areas in this game. In terms of abilities, I sorely missed her screw attack for many sections of this game. And of all the games to really utilize it in terms of space, Prime 4 had the most potential and the most space for this. Where was the screw attack? I think it should have been there. I also felt that her abilities overall just weren't used enough through the game. The Morph Ball was for the most part, but the Grappling Beam, although used in some parts, could have been used for much more, especially for traversal and combat. And talking about the screw attack, and once again, in terms of this Prime game being the most open, where was her speed boost? That could have been a Prime first. I'm sure that would have been used to great effect in many areas, especially so valuable for some people. And this is a Metroid Prime game. We only had one visor in this game, which was pretty much just a scan visor. X-ray and thermal vision could have been put to great use in many areas of this game. Then the psychic visor itself could have been the fourth visor. And its use, to reveal hidden platforms, etc. Because even without the psychic visor active, you still see pink visions of interactive things, and then you just turn to the scan visor to actually unlock it. Which made the game feel even easier in terms of discovery, I feel. But hell, even a ledge grab was missing in this game. One new ability though I did really enjoy was a psychic ball, and how you could catapult yourself between psychic nodes. Yet still, there wasn't enough of this. And as I mentioned in an entire video, Samus absolutely needed to speak in this game, but not also speak. We needed to see her face when she interacted with the Federation troopers, and also momentarily, who also momentarily removed their masks when discussing important things. Many of Samus's, blank reactions to the troopers felt out of character, out of place, and at times pretty cold, almost giving a hard shoulder, which in this situation of being alone on an alien world is something Samus Aran, would certainly not do. She'd want to protect those troopers at all costs. Even with all these niggles, I couldn't help, but enjoy the journey of Prime 4. And it felt just as good playing through it a second time. But as I was going to, but if I was going to have one major issue with this game, because all those other ones, are Metroid issues, Samus issues and stuff like that, but they don't fundamentally break the game. But if I was going to have one major issue with this game, it would be the story. So I'm going to just talk spoilers a second. And so if you're not interested, then you have to drop out here and towards the end. I'm not talking about even like the story of the Federation troopers or the Le Mans. I actually really enjoyed the Le Mans story and found it quite sad. Given they had lost everything. My issue was with the inclusion of Sylux, of all things. And I'd done a whole video of Sylux. I just thought his inclusion could have been great. But something went wrong here. And I think it's clear that a lot of content for his story was either missing, or even, more of a scary thought, was felt like it wasn't needed. Sylux, his Metroids and Space Pirates should have been vastly more present in Prime 4, I feel. It was almost like he was never part of the main story. He was the intro boss, but that's it for like 99% of the game. The main story suddenly changed to the Le Mans for the whole game, which was fine by me. Like I said, I really enjoyed their story, but you were always left wondering what was the point of him, at the start of the game or even at the end of the game. It was like they are trying to set him up as an already established character we should, really know, when in reality, we don't. Not even the hardcore Metroid fans. As much as they go on about Metroid Prime Hunters and the end of Prime 3, we don't really know Samus. He hasn't been in the games that much. And another odd thing is that the text, against bosses when you scan them, it like seemingly mentioned that they have been taken control of by Metroids. But as soon as you come to Vuros, you don't see a single Metroid at all. This is where Sylux and the Space Pirates should have been a constant menace in the game. Where he's doing everything he can to obtain the keys from you. And maybe turns these bosses against you by clearly infecting them with Metroids. Him and the Space Pirates, a small number of them, also transported to the world, should have had, they could have had like those little mini bases, set up somewhere, like they do in the other Prime games. Where they are, where they too are also trying to obtain the keys, or they discover the green energy or something, as well as turning the Le Mans creations against you. The Federation troopers should, also, would have also been engaged with them, at times, so I also added to the story. Then finally at the end, Sylux himself manages to like harness the psychic powers, and that final boss battle, could stay the same, but only with Samus not choosing to push the teleporter button, herself, but perhaps for like, I don't know, Duke or Miles, locking her in there as it's activated or something. I just felt that she just wouldn't do that. So, how do I feel overall about Metroid Prime 4? I personally think it's a great game. Absolutely worth playing. No doubt about it. As a Metroid fan, based off my comments in this video, there are clearly things I would want and also change here. And I do wonder if this was someone's first Metroid Prime game, what would they think about it as a space avenger set in a sci-fi universe with a character who has so many of these unique abilities. Even if many are missing, from my eyes. They wouldn't know that, but I would. Even after completing it twice and started again on casual to capture some additional footage for this video, I couldn't help but still enjoy myself with the game. Retro Studios clearly still have the talent, and even with this long and troubled development, they have delivered a game which for me had zero bugs, looks stunning, plays exceptionally well, and sounds amazing. and has some really, really great moments. And each gamer will decide on what, gameplay story-wise, will annoy them or not. But there is fundamentally nothing broken with Prime 4. Just for me, oddly enough, it needed just a bit more of Prime and also slightly more, I say slightly more, absolutely more Samus Aran. It's hard not to shake the feeling that this game was made a bit more linear, to bring in a wider crowd. And I think you can see that more in the map design if you compared other, Metroid Prime maps to Prime 4. But yeah, more in this map, design than anything else. But fortunately, given Retro Studios' art direction, you can also look past it, as the game is just so nice to look at, and it's still great to move through these locations. It's just great. So if you want to score from me, I can't help, but give it an 8 out of 10. Maybe that's a little bit of bias, but I still think it's just a great game. I say 8 out of 10, which for some might be in the lower end of a Metroid Prime game, because we do rate them 10 out of 10, 9 out of 10 games. I do. Thinking back, people gave Metroid Prime 2 and Metroid Prime 3 grief. So the grief that Prime 4 is seeing is, in my mind, nothing new. But ultimately, 8 out of 10 is still in the higher end of a review score. As I said before, please play Metroid Prime 4, and at the same time, just play Metroid in general. The series deserves it, and then some. So, thanks for listening all. Look forward to your comments as always. Take care and stay beautiful.